Hey students, how are you? I hope everybody's doing well. Um, I am trying to just make it through the boredom. I've been pretty busy doing stuff around the house. Uh, but anyway, I'm gonna do a small clip on the Cold War. Okay, remember that this unit is thematic, so that means that you'll be going from the very beginning of the Cold War, which is October 1917, when Vladimir Lenin overthrows Tsar Nicholas, and then you have well, actually the Bolsheviks, and then there's another little mini revolution in there. But anyway, the Cold War begins in 1917. Now, there are some periods after World War One where we have a Red Scare, America's fear of communism. But this is really going to be amplified uh, after World War Two. After World War Two, you're going to have two superpowers. You're going to have the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets are always going to be sore at the United States because they're the ones that use the most manpower. They're the ones that lost more than anybody else, people than anybody else, and the United States equipped them with um, uh, supplies. Okay, now what's going to happen, and this is where you're going to have to come in and read about it, is that we're going to have the demarcation of Europe. In other words, when the Russians come in and go to Berlin, they're going to keep a lot of those European countries that are there, like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Hungary. They're going to install puppet governments in order to create a buffer zone through there. And the United States is going to do this, and the Allies are going to do the same. And I really want you to focus on the issue of the spread of communism. Okay, when Truman decides to drop the atomic bomb and expedites the war, then what you're going to have is that because of where Russia is situated, most of Russia is frozen all of the time. So they do not have access to warm water ports. And what they're going to try and do is that they're going to try and coax governments like Greece and Turkey to become communist so they can have access to the Red Sea or the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean. And that's where the big battles are going to come out. Now, the Cold War is called the Cold War because there's never really, well, with the exception of Korea, the Korean conflict, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you have to pay attention to things like the Truman Doctrine. You're going to have to pay attention to things like the Marshall Plan. Uh, you're going to have to pay attention to the Berlin blockade, okay? Uh, and then what we're going to look at is that you're going to have a gradual escalation of nuclear weapons, a nuclear arms race that's basically going to escalate. It's like when the United States had the atomic bomb, they have the upper hand. Then Russia gets the atomic bomb, so they both are equal. Then the United States gets the hydrogen bomb, and they have the upper hand. And then the Russians get the hydrogen bomb, so they're even. And then China gets the atomic bomb, and then China comes into play. Now, the other thing about China is that in China we've got Chiang Kai-shek that's going to get overthrown by Mao, okay? And that's going to create a lot of problems in the United States because you're going to see that Truman's not being hard enough on communism, okay? In addition to that, we're going to have the invasion of South Korea by North Korea, and the United States is going to get drawn into a conflict in Korea that is spearheaded at first by General Douglas MacArthur, and then later on he is replaced. When he's replaced, and what happens in Korea is it's actually a really a big misfortune where the United States and NATO forces actually lose. It's a tie, and Korea is cut at the 38th parallel. Okay, so we have a democratic South Korea and a communist North Korea. Okay, now we're also going to have things going on at the beginning of the 1950s in Vietnam, and then Vietnam is going to explode into a big deal. And of course, I will not be giving you a video on Vietnam, but I will be giving you some movies to watch on Vietnam, because the best way that we can describe Vietnam is by saying that it's a quagmire. Okay. Now, in addition to that, the Cold War also spills out into Latin America. So I want you to look into Chile. I want you to look into Nicaragua. All this is in your book. We have Augusto Pinochet in Chile. We have Arbenz in Nicaragua. Those are the major things. And of course, we need to look at the Cold War in the Middle East. Remember, the Middle East was becomes a disaster after World War One, and we're going to have some issues in the Middle East. Not necessarily communism, but the rise of jihads. And of course, the Russians are very willing to give the Middle Eastern countries supplies in exchange for bases or access to warm water ports. Now, eventually, the Russians are not going to be able to keep up the spending that the United States has. This is the age of the nuclear family. This is the age of the credit card. This is the age of obsolescence, where items are supposed to be, instead of keeping a blender or a car or an appliance for the duration of its lifetime, most things are planned either to uh, be phased out or to just get out of vogue, and you're going to get something else. It's kind of like our phones, right? For 2G phones, well, my 2G phone, there's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't work on a 3G network anymore. So they force you to do things. This is the age of opulent spending, okay? This is the age of the military industrial complex. And with that, we also have nuclear weaponry and wars, which would eventually cause us to mutually destruct each other, okay? You're going to have an escalation under Truman. Under Eisenhower, he's going to put a lot of money into schools and try to make the fighting more sophisticated. And then after Eisenhower, you're going to have Kennedy. And I've always said Kennedy is a Cold War killer. You know what I mean? You're going to have him go after Castro. You're going to have the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And you're also going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which in my opinion is the closest we've ever been to nuclear holocaust. After his assassination, you're going to have LBJ. Now, LBJ comes out. He's going to start a social program called the War on Poverty. Okay. And basically what's going to happen there is that it's kind of like a rekindling of the New Deal. But what's going to happen is that Vietnam is going to get in the way. Uh, he is going to be the one that is really going to have some troop escalation going on in Vietnam. Now, LBJ doesn't run for re-election. He does not run for re-election. He finishes out JFK's term, and then he does one term on his own, and then Nixon becomes president. Okay, now Nixon is actually going to be the one that is going to end the war in Vietnam, but before he ends the war in Vietnam, he's going to escalate it and bomb Cambodia, because that's where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is. Okay, and that's when we're going to get a lot of student unrest. Okay. And then, of course, he gets caught up in the Watergate fiasco, and that's pretty much it for him. Gerald Ford becomes the president. Vietnam is over. But the Cold War continues, okay? Uh, Nixon, like JFK, were Cold War warriors. They hated communism. I mean, they despised it. So I know that this is a lot of just bits and pieces and ends, but I hope that as you're reading, you'll remember these things that I mentioned and I've talked about, in the sense of that the Cold War is just, lasts pretty much from the Truman era until the Berlin Wall comes down. But you do have a de-escalation. Eventually, capitalism prevails over communism and socialism, and we pretty much just outspend them. That's what we do. In addition to that, we're gonna have, this is the age of James Bond. Of we have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg that are put to death for spying. You have a lot of sinister things going on from both sides, not just the Russians. Okay, for example, look up. I forget how many times they tried to kill. The United States had to have Castro killed, or you'll have people like Joseph Tito, that again was a communist, but he didn't like Stalin. The big ugly guy here in communism is Joseph Stalin, who was responsible for the murder and starvation of millions of his countrymen. Okay, he was ruthless, absolutely ruthless individual. But after Stalin, you'll have Khrushchev, who of course backs down to JFK. And like I said, I know I'm all over the place here, but if you do your reading, a lot of this stuff will make sense. And if you have any more questions, make sure you ask. But we're going from 1917 all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I hope that you all are doing well. Uh, you all take care of yourselves and try to stay home as much as you can. Okay? I don't think I forgot anything. I'm pretty sure I did, but look at your study pages in the back of OpenStack and in the back of your books. And like I said, I'll let you take the exams twice, because I know that so some of you are not used to taking face-to-face class. I mean, online classes, and you were in a face-to-face class. All right, you all take care and be kind to each other.